Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternative Podcast. Don leading the charge today, but only temporarily. I'm going to get out of the driver's seat here at some point, and Dylan's actually going to lead the episode today. In fact, on the spreadsheet that we use to track this episode, Dylan's column will have an L because he's technically going to be leading the episode. So whatever goes well here, Don still takes credit for. Whatever goes poorly here, Dylan takes the blame for, just so we're clear on that. But I'm glad to be joined today by a cross-section of the team, and also glad to be joined today by one of our listeners who's joining us. And Evan, we'll meet Evan here in a minute, is one of our more active participants on our Discord server. We keep hawking that and pumping that, and the reason we do, we really enjoy the two-way conversations that we're able to have there and the interchange that takes place. But in no particular order, that's not true. In fact, I hate that. I've said that before. In no significant order. I'm going to go in a particular order because you have to go in a particular order. But in no significant order other than these upper left, there's Chris Capola.
Hi, good people.
All right, we've taken care of that. It's official now. We'll slide back around to Dylan. Robert Koshue's joining us today. Robert, how's your day treating you?
Very nice. Start of college football, so all is good in the world.
All is good in the world, and there's still baseball out there. So for those of us that enjoy both sides of the coin, we're good to go. And Dylan Holzheimer, who is our resident. I'm not going to even say what your shirt says on it, Dylan, because I know you're ashamed of it. Because your wife's dressing you, apparently, as we discovered a little bit off podcast, at least when it comes to which college shirt he's wearing the colors for today. But Dylan's going to be leading us out here. But good to have you, Dylan. How are you today?
Doing fine. I'm a little sunburned. We the weather dropped from about 100 to 86 today. We had a storm come in. So unfortunately, I did what I always do when it's finally good golfing weather. And I figured I could get away without sunscreen, as you can see, and the listeners unfortunately can't. I look a little more like a lobster than a person right now, but we're going to make it work.
All right. And I'm very happy that we have Evan Buck joining us today. Evan, if you want to tell our listeners a little bit about, I know you've shared with us a little about how you found A Fork in Time and a little bit about yourself and the part of the reason Evan is joining today. He's been an active participant there on the Discord server and in the other feedbacks there, but also he suggested the topic. So again, if it goes well, I'm taking the credit, and if it goes poorly, Dylan still gets the blame. That's just when you get the L under your name in the column. That's just the way it works, Dylan. So Evan, take it away.
Yeah. How's it going, everyone? It's your boy, Evan. And I found the podcast a few months back when I had just finished like a couple seasons of the Amazon special, The Man in the High Castle. And I just really liked this idea of alternate history. I've always been interested in it. And I wanted to find a podcast that explored those avenues and forks in time. And that's how I found the podcast. And ever since, I've just been really enjoying it. And when I found out they had a Discord too, I'm just like, oh, perfect. It marries my, online Discord presence and sense of community with, my historical nerdological pursuits and everything. Just really honored to be on the show and talking it up with you guys about all things nerdy, historical, and wonderful.
That's us. That probably describes us as well as any three words possible can. It's really good to have you, Evan. All right, Dylan, we are going back in time, and we're going back to 1861-ish eventually, but we're really going to start, I guess, back in a little bit before that. So I'll let you lead us in and set up the topic here with the historical what did, and then what our fork's going to look like. You're muted, Dylan.
Yeah, so to kind of set the milieu a little bit, we're going back to just before the Civil War. So this is the 1850s in the United States. We are entering what is going to become essentially the second great party realignment. And by that, I mean the parties basically fall apart and decide to basically make a bunch of stuff up. Everybody does whatever they want. And the election cycle goes, kind of bonkers because of it. You've got the Democratic Party, who is, the sort of the entrenched conservative Old South, tend to be pro-slavery by the 1850s as you start having the question over territories getting incorporated as free or slave states start to come in. You have the last gasp of the Whigs under Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, who, for all his not very many pluses, just cannot catch a break in the 1850s. Poor Millard. He is the last gasp of the Whig Party. You've got John C. Fremont as the first Republican presidential candidate. This is the beginning of the Republican Party. And you've got these guys known as the Know Nothings. Basically, they're a nativist party, when the Whigs sort of to completely fall apart, the ones that didn't go to the Republicans that were kind of more conservative, traditional, but didn't want to go to the Democrats. They started this sort of nativist party where basically they were afraid of all the Irish immigrants. They were afraid of all the Roman Catholics who were going to take away all the King James Bibles. They didn't want the immigrants stealing their hard-earned white Protestant European, one generation removed from the Mayflower native, quote unquote, American labor. And so they created their own political party. And this is sort of the background that we have in the 1858 gubernatorial election in Maryland. Now, just to give you guys an idea of where Maryland is, it's directly north of Washington, D.C. Directly south of Washington, D.C. is Richmond area around Virginia. Now, you may recognize, given the time period that we're about to be in, what's going to happen with Virginia and everything south of it in the Civil War. So this election in Maryland, which is a slave state, is kind of pivotal because what ends up happening is a know-nothing sort of kind of Republican-ish governor ends up winning in 1858 by the name of, I have it here, Thomas Holiday Hicks. Yes, yep. Like a wild Western gunslinger. I love it. Hicks wins the gubernatorial election, and through some stuff we're going to get into in a little bit, basically probably helps sort of tilt Maryland, which is kind of on this knife's edge, into staying in the Unionist camp as opposed to seceding maybe with a lot of its other border state brethren in the Civil War in 1861 once hostilities break out. So our fork for today is, what if the Democrat won instead of the Know Nothing? So his opponent in this 1858 gubernatorial election was a guy by the name of Groome. Now, Groome was a Democrat, and Evan actually pointed out that this election was rife with fraud. I think Hicks won by like 8,700 votes or something like that in a widely acknowledged, like even at the time, kind of sketchy gubernatorial election, ballot stuffing, intimidation, just general beating up of people walking out of the polling places. So it's entirely conceivable that this may have gone the other direction. So that's our fork. What if the Democrat wins in the gubernatorial election? And I want to take it to Evan to kind of give us sort of the real transition here, because 1858, 1859, we probably don't have a whole lot happening. 1860, Lincoln wins his election. It's really late 1860, early 1861 that we start seeing where we would have diverged from the timeline. And I think we've got some interesting events that might get us there. So, Evan, you got any particular jumping off point you think where we might start seeing some divergences here?
Yeah, so the reason that we have chosen this to be our fork in time is because essentially really the topic, what it boils down to is, what if Maryland had decided as a border state to instead join the Confederacy as opposed to remaining with the Union? And so when I was thinking about this topic, I was trying to find as you guys typically do, find a realistic, conceivable fork in time. And so this is what kind of struck me as a good way of doing it, because in our timeline, the Know Nothing governor, Thomas Hicks, was very strongly pro-Union. And so in the lead up to the Civil War, and I forget exactly when that happened, I want to say in April of 1861, he basically called a special session of the Maryland General Assembly, and he purposely put it in pro-Union town Frederick, Maryland, rather than the capital, Annapolis, which is kind of more of a like neutral-ish / slightly Confederate leaning part of the state. He purposely did this. It's kind of like when people do like judge shopping or court shopping when they're trying to file a lawsuit. They're like, okay, let's bring this, very large, complicated case about patent trolls which is in, like Silicon Valley area. Yeah, let's file that in North Texas, which is totally not known for being very pro, leniency on patent laws or anything. Basically, that's what Hicks did here. He's like, yeah, let me call an assembly, but let's do it in Frederick as opposed to Annapolis. And so because of this, his personality, his advocacy, this probably heavily weighed into the decision of the legislature to stay in the Union. And so in our fork, we instead are going to have the governor be the Democrat, John Charles Groom. And although he was also more of a unionist type, according to Dylan's excellent research that I'm referencing here, he seemed to be very much of a kind of a people pleaser, trying to make sure that everybody is happy. And he would have, more likely than not, just based on his personal affability, tried to make the process more neutral. And thus, this is very likely that he might have scheduled the special session in Annapolis or even Baltimore. And that might have had a much different result. Also in April of 1861, around the same time that this was going on with the secession votes, we actually have the first blood of the Civil War spilled, and that was in the Baltimore riots of 1861. And on April 19th of that year, there were some anti-war Copperhead Democrats, which they were the largest political party in Maryland at the time. There were some other Confederate sympathizers on one side, and there were some members of the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania state militia regiments who were on their way to Washington. And so essentially the Confederate sympathizers were not really too happy having the Union troops being staged there. And so that was kind of the main cause of the riots. Now, Dylan, you can correct me here, but as far as I'm aware, the Copperheads were not pro-Confederate per se, but they were just not really wanting to go to war with them. Is my assumption there right?
Yeah, Copperheads usually they tended to be just more peace Democrats. They'd be, I guess, in our political parlance, you might call them dovish instead of hawkish, but dovish to an extreme in sort of this scenario. Like they want peace, they don't want to. Even if it means sundering the Union, they're not for secession, but they don't want to fight over it.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
And then the other thing that jumped out at me just about the setup there, Evan, is that what I didn't realize until I guess I probably had heard this, but I didn't realize is that Baltimore is a confluence of rail lines, multiple rail lines. And so what's actually happened here, what causes this to overflow into the streets is obviously the hostility that's going on. What's going on with Sumter is happening here. The votes are all the things that are happening in the background here. But these Union troops that are on their way to Washington come to Baltimore and they can't stay on the same train. They literally have to get off the train they're on, walk across town to another station to get another line because the lines weren't connected. And it's that walk across town and the interaction between the folks that are coming from the north, the folks that are there. It's just this sort of thing, The other way we could have changed the timeline here is just, connect some rail lines and you won't have an issue here. Perhaps,
yeah, true.
At the end of the
day,
day,
could have stopped the riot altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, that's a good note. And also as a side note in my research as well, this was actually what led Abraham Lincoln to suspend the rights of habeas corpus, because I've heard about that before, like this kind of a controversial thing that Lincoln decided to do, the whole Supreme Court case and everything. But I didn't know when and why he did that. He actually did this a little over a week later. And so he instructed none other than everybody's favorite war general, Winfield Scott, on April 27th of 1861. To basically carry out the suspension of the rights of habeas corpus. I
would like to point out, just for all the listeners, for a mental image, because I have a feeling Winfield Scott might come up a little bit in this episode. This is not Mexican-American War Winfield Scott. This is a man
he was
who
big even then, though.
Yeah, but at this point, we're talking about a Winfield Scott who has to get This is like William Howard Taft levels of Winfield. He has to get winched onto his horse. And then the poor horse is going to break his back out just trying to get him like 40 yards to wherever he's got to go. So just sorry to interject, but that's the Winfield Scott we're talking about here.
A very good side note there. Yeah, he's not the young and spry, Mexican-American war general that we all know. He's pretty advanced at this point.
He's young and spry during the War of 1812, Robert.
Yes, correct. Very correct.
Yeah, 100%. But he's still alive and kicking. He's still helping out. And so Lincoln gives him that task. So basically, what ends up happening in our timeline is Maryland becomes more of a Union Army staging ground. There were a lot of people who were on both sides of the war, and leadership, even though they were Unionist, they were one of the very few Union slave states, and so their sympathies were definitely divided. They sought to stay out of the war as much as possible in a sort of active military engagement sense. Did that really work out? Well, probably the biggest Civil War battle, the single bloodiest day of the war, the Battle of Antietam, actually happened in Maryland, or Battle of Sharpsburg. So there were some big battles that happened there. But in terms of actual support for the Union cause, Maryland tried to thread the needle. They tried to still remain being part of the Union, but they also didn't really want to actively support the war against the South as much.
Yeah. And so that's a really, really good setup of like everything that's at play here. And I want to just point out for people who listen, because until I was looking into stuff, I did not realize just, in terms of the dominoes that start falling in the early days of the Civil War, I did not realize how close a lot of these were to each other. Because you've got the Baltimore riot on April 19th. The convention then gets called after that. So Lincoln is already dealing with Fort Sumter was what, early April, late March, if I remember correctly. So it's Fort Sumter has happened. You've got a couple states that have seceded. Everybody's kind of on the knife edge. April 19th, the Baltimore riot happens. The convention for Maryland secession is happening. Lincoln suspends habeas corpus on April 27th. 2 days later, in the real timeline, the convention votes. They stay in the Union. The logistics question is something I think that's really going to be kind of crucial in this episode, because they actually, one of their conditions for, hey, we're going to stay in the Union is we don't want you to use our rail lines. And Lincoln just kind of said, yeah, no, we're going to keep doing what we want.
Yeah.
So that was,
yeah, I think it's pretty, you set that up really well there, Dylan. I think it's kind of easy especially for me, I'll speak for myself. You kind of think of the different Union and Confederate states as being like all, one side or the other. And that's very much not the case. I forget where in Tennessee it was. I want to say Middle Tennessee or East Tennessee. That was actually rather pro-Union. And so there's definitely shades of nuance that are in the historical reality.
If
in
you
our
look
timeline.
at every single state that seceded along the Appalachian Trail, you can see the counties in the Appalachians did not want to secede, be that Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a marvel. West Virginia is not bigger than it is.
Yeah, we have
because all of those guys all kind of run along the Appalachians right there.
Yeah, and West Virginia will probably come up later in this episode. Yeah, so that'll be fun. But yeah, just something that I noted myself as I did the research is it's like, I think Maryland is, we kind of underestimate how Southern sympathizing and politically reactionary they were. John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's assassin, was actually from the state of Maryland. And they were also in the election of 1860. They were the one non-Southern state that voted for Breckinridge, the Democratic nominee. And so it's something to, as Dylan pointed out, just one little different domino effect, one little change could have actually had Maryland on a different side of the war. So
and another part of that dichotomy there is John Brown. Prior to
because Harper's Ferry is right on the border.
Yep,
right,
exactly.
His operations are based in Maryland. When he's preparing to stage for the insurrection and the uprising, and so it's there. And Chris, you are from Maryland.
Yeah,
or that's where you live now. It's not where you're from, but that's where you live now. But so one of the things I would like to know, and sorry, Dylan, to jump in.
No, please. I think you're going exactly where I was going to go.
Yeah,
Chris is our token Marylander for this episode.
Yes, is it?
You can fact check us live.
For example, I know how Robert and I know this because we're Texans. Dylan's experience, being there from Tennessee, he has his experience. Evan, you have your experience. When folks in Maryland talk about the Civil War today, Chris, what do you hear?
First and foremost, Marylanders generally, you make.
Sorry, is it Marylandians? Did I get that wrong?
It is Marylanders. By the way, everybody from outside of a certain city refers to the people that conducted that riot as Baltimoreans. I'm just telling you that right now.
Love it.
I think we just might have found part of our episode name.
Yeah, I'm always looking for the
I
title.
don't
and
know.
we've had it.
That might offend some sensibilities.
Yeah.
I could care less. Maryland didn't secede, so it doesn't generally consider itself part of the South, despite the fact that the Mason-Dixon line is the border between Maryland
I was just
and
going to bring that up.
Pennsylvania. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And we were the only, other than Delaware, Maryland and Delaware both went for Breckinridge. Both were slave states. Both did not secede.
And Maryland basically did not go at all as I was looking at the election results. Lincoln was just like a non-existent
Right.
entity.
He got 0 votes.
Yeah.
Literally, it was
Literally
Breckinridge
0.
and Bell.
Yep.
I think he may have sued to get his name taken off the ballot. That's the only thing I can think of. For those of you,
go for it, Chris.
people are laughing, huh?
No,
got it.
I was gonna cut you off, and then I didn't want to go. You look like you were gonna go on a tear.
Oh,
But
no.
I do want to point out there's one thing. So in the lead up to this, I have discovered Lincoln. So to kind of keep giving more context for the frame here, this is a president, Abraham Lincoln, who won 40%, if that. I think 38% of the popular vote, because this is a 4-way election. So we're talking about a president who is potentially going to be surrounded by Confederate territory, who has to tread very carefully in the middle of all this. So he has to play his cards very delicately to keep.
The one thing I'm finding interesting, and I just want to throw this: when were the Baltimore riots again?
19th of April.
1861.
19th?
Yeah,
April
1861.
1861, yeah.
Yeah,
What day in April?
19th.
April 19th.
19th. 2 days after Virginia seceded.
Yeah.
Up until that point, this is a very different situation.
Yeah.
But as soon as that happens, then it becomes a surrounding issue. Up until then, it wasn't.
Well, and so just to kind of, we haven't quite gotten into May yet, but eventually, so Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. And so when Maryland in our timeline votes to stay in the Union, they ask about the rail lines. Lincoln says no, and then sends federal troops in, not like in a military invasion, but he very clearly is like, all right, there's some boys in blue that are going to sit on the tracks, and you guys just have to deal with it. And then a couple weeks later, I think May
13th.
May 3rd. So this is how close all this is. May 3rd, a lot of the upper South secedes.
So to get back to Evan's point about picking a jury, for example, as you may have pointed out, I am not a native Marylander. I did grow up in North Carolina. May 20th, they seceded as soon as Lincoln called out federal troops to actively put down the rebellion. And if you happen to remind people that the entire state of North Carolina was a draft dodger, you will get sent to the principal's office. At that point, it is advisable to tell them to call your Massachusetts-born father versus your Virginia-born mother.
Know who's got your back, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was on May 13th. Lincoln sends in
the federal occupation of Baltimore.
Well, he sends Butler in. It's not just an occupation. He sends Butler in under cover of a storm. They occupy Federal Hill, if I've got my geography correct, which basically overlooks the city. He cables Fort McHenry and says, if you hear me do anything, start shelling the city center with your mortars.
Federal Hill is kind of close to Baltimore's Little Italy now.
Okay.
It's kind of like Bunker Hill. It overlooks the inner harbor.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And so, I mean, occupation is a generous word in my mind because it's basically, we're here. You start doing anything, I've got 1,000 federal troops. We're going to start throwing shells, and we're going to have the fort in the harbor start throwing shells in as well. And then we'll just burn your city to the ground. So it's very much he very, very much decided it wasn't just, no, that's not going to happen. It's no, I'm doing whatever I want. You
Mhm.
just need to go away.
Yeah, this was
Yeah,
a big part in, Lincoln being very forceful early on because he was, as we noted, he was trying to juggle, the possibility of his administration being surrounded by, hostile rebel troops, hostile territory. Um, and I'll just throw a side note in here as well. With the other border states, right? So we got, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Delaware had already rejected secession, as pretty much everybody had expected. Like, I want to say it was in January of 61. Because South Carolina was the first one to vote in December of 1860. And so Delaware just kind of really quickly took up as a sort of formality. All right, do you guys want to do it? No. Boom. Because that was one thing that I thought of is would Delaware and other border states have possibly joined the Confederacy if Maryland had decided to secede? Abraham Lincoln himself said, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. He was very adamant in keeping these border states around. And so I think he would have said the exact same thing for Maryland, just because the optics of having your nation's capital being surrounded by rebel territory and possibly, being captured, it would have been pretty bad early on. And so, like, we can envision, basically the government having to flee down the Potomac and set up shop somewhere else. I don't think Delaware would have reconsidered their stance after Maryland left. Delaware, even though they did have, I think, around 20,000 slaves, they had many more freed African Americans at this point. And they had a lot of abolition, movement people in that state. They also pride themselves on being the first states that signed on to, in the 1770s, then or 1780s with the Constitutional Convention. They were the first state. So I think culturally speaking, they're not as antebellum South as, Maryland was. They had some slaves, not really a lot. Do you guys kind of agree with me there? I don't think
Yeah.
Delaware would have joined or
Delaware
reconsidered
doesn't
at all.
go.
I think the peninsula might have, there might have been some counties that kind of broke away, along the Maryland border, because that's really the Confederate part is the peninsula where they have more of the sharecropping and more of the farming. But yeah, I don't think Delaware's going to go anywhere.
I
So-
think,
so-
I think
so
the
that
key part,
Good.
looking at the Maryland map that went both for our Governor Groom and for Breckinridge, it's the Chesapeake Bay. Because if you look at a lot of these areas, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, it's waterways that your proximity to a navigable waterway almost is a really good determinant of how you're going to feel about secession. In Tennessee, Memphis, and the areas along the Tennessee River, very pro-secession.
It's all commercial, transactional basis. That's where you can
Because
ship your stuff.
they can grow large amounts of export agricultural goods. If
Mhm.
you look up in the mountainous areas where they're, growing sustenance crops and things like that, they don't have the economic system that necessitates large scale agriculture, that necessitates a slavery, that encourages secession. So I think the thing about Delaware, while they may have had slavery, they didn't have the geographic structure to support a large export economy. When if you look in Maryland, areas like St. Mary's and Charles County, which are southern, it's now referred to as Southern Maryland. It's the part like south of DC that kind of goes along that's wedged between the Potomac and the Chesapeake. Those are the areas where you're seeing the highest vote totals for secessionist candidates. That is where John Wilkes Booth is from. That's the part of Maryland that is the most likely to support it. And right next door to that is Anne Arundel County and Annapolis.
So one of the questions that I have that flows off of that, just to get it out here if we can, I presume this is where I sort of want to get established. I think it's going to flow a lot from what we do from here. It is not a sustainable position for the U.S. Capitol to remain actively located in the District of Columbia if it is completely surrounded? Do we all agree that you have to do that, or is there, I guess the reason I asked that question, because to me that's a given, because tactically, strategically, you just got a problem there. But the flip side of that would be almost this symbolic thing of we're not giving up the capital, which is what would be the balance against that. And while that's not, strategically or tactically sound, that doesn't mean somebody won't do it at the end of the day.
Yeah. So the way I kind of envisioned this is, just say you've got a Maryland secession, the end of April, beginning of May, you've got and I could be completely wrong on this, but the way I envision it is like almost like Fortress Baltimore as the main Confederate bastion of the sort of secessionist Maryland, because I think there's going to be some counties sort of on the northern western end that are just going to kind of like, yeah, we're just going to go like stick with Pennsylvania or whatever. Like they're just going to do
they
their
might
own
have
thing.
they might have gone with they might have gone along with the West Virginia.
Yeah.
This is where
Exactly.
West Virginia comes in.
That's what I was thinking. Is West Virginia bigger now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it incorporates some of the Western
Maryland
counties.
All that Western Maryland area might have ended up being in West Virginia today. Because I don't think this. Oh, sorry, you can go ahead.
No. I like where you guys are heading, because I was going to say I don't know that Washington would be surrounded yet, being the operative question.
Yeah, I would have to look at the geography of this. The Wheeling Convention, which is what was basically the western side of Virginia, trying to break away, that happened in 1861. So pretty much at the same time as the Baltimore riots.
Yeah.
I honestly think that if Maryland secedes, this would have caused whatever counties in Western Maryland to try and join up with Pennsylvania or West Virginia. West Virginia was already on their way out at this point. They are, even though they're technically part of Virginia still, they haven't fully, been carved out as a new state yet. They're functionally out of reach of the Confederacy. So that's where I think this is going to go.
I feel like there might be almost a Kentucky situation where you could have, or a Missouri situation where you have two different governments.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that.
One government of Maryland setting itself up in Frederick.
Yeah.
And another
one in like Baltimore.
And the other thing, just to, for more local flavor, there is currently a rail line that runs from Pittsburgh through Harper's Ferry, West Virginia area, Martinsburg, West Virginia, all the way into Washington, D.C. That is literally the commuter rail that I take every day along the Potomac. And these go through hardcore Unionist areas. So
there's definitely a corridor that can keep them going.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that sets up the tactical kind of start of the war question.
I've got is, though, there's a corridor there, but is there enough troop strength? Because remember, what started the whole riots was we're bringing troops down because we don't have nowhere. Remember, the United States Army prior to secession was a small little frontier force out in the West mainly. And remember also that the vast majority of I won't say the vast majority, but a good chunk of Army commanders are no longer United States Army members. Yeah, and how many of their people did they take with them? So while there may be a corridor, do you want to risk your capital being 100% cut off and your government, or do you evacuate the government to, say, Philadelphia?
I think it's a much more likely possibility that they do that. From everything I know about Jefferson Davis and just the Confederate government in general, they believed themselves to be the rightful heirs of the spirit of the American Revolution. And so I think that once they had, either total, surrounding of DC or near complete if some Western areas break off, I think they would have been salivating. I think they would have been just, biting at the chomp to be like, you know what, let's go and embarrass the Union. And let's also try and get maybe some European powers on our side, because that was one of the biggest things in our timeline that I'm not just going to say it's one of the biggest things, but it was a big factor in our timeline that made the Confederate war effort not succeed was the fact that they weren't able to get a Britain or, kind of in our timeline in the American Revolution, a France on their side. And so the Confederates were lobbying like really hard to get the British on their side to kind of help break the big naval blockade that was going on. And so I think, I think that the government flees. And I don't think they set up shop in Philadelphia because, remember, Philadelphia is on what border? The Maryland border. Now, maybe those Western counties might have still been Unionist, but I think in all likelihood, it's more likely that the government gets set up in New York or even Boston. This actually loops back an episode that I listened to because I've been listening, kind of binging all of the old episodes, as I'm sure Don is very well aware. I remember this really fascinating one, episode 76 of the podcast, where it basically has William Seward as president instead of Lincoln. Do you guys remember that one?
Vaguely,
yeah. So in that one, it was kind of like one of those listener timeline ones, and I forget the name of the gentleman who gave the timeline, but he essentially gave all the border states. So he gave Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. He gave them all to the Confederacy. And he made the argument, and he made the point that it probably would have made more sense for the government to end up in Boston. And so that's just an interesting side note. But yeah, I personally feel like, there's another episode that I can reference here as well. One of the weather episodes talking about how like the rain prevented Washington from burning down in the War of 1812. And Don, I believe you made the point that there would have been much less impact to the British completely burning DC in the War of 1812. Because at that point, Washington had not really been the capital for very long. I don't know exactly when Washington became the capital, but we're talking now about fast forward 50 years later, we're talking about a much bigger city. It's basically not glorified swampland anymore. It's much more developed. There's a lot more history there. We have, the White House and Congress and everything that's there. So I think it would have been a much bigger psychological blow to the Union cause for a capital that has been there for 50 years to have fallen. Do I think that necessarily gives the Confederacy a huge strategic benefit? I don't personally think so, and we can get into the specifics of that later. But I think in terms of the beginning stages of the war, having that essentially PR, of we have Baltimore, we have this big, we surrounded and captured DC, we made Lincoln's government flee down the Potomac, set up shop somewhere else. I think that would have been pretty powerful propaganda at the start of the war.
And you have to, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm going to stand off and say, I don't think they take, I think basically, if you look at what happened, the Confederates did not mount offensive operations.
1862.
They took a while.
I think the question is what happens later? What happens the rest of 61 is the question.
So I'm saying even if you have split governments, I think instead of worrying about occupying suburban Virginia, we go ahead and settle Baltimore's hash.
That's what I was going to say. I think Lincoln actually moves against Baltimore with whatever he's got, because you've got, I think Meade might be in the capital by this time. I think McClellan's still there. Winfield Scott's poor horse is probably praying to God that it doesn't have to get wheeled out. I think they may try to, because Lincoln snuck federal troops into Baltimore on May 13th, I think. So, he's at least got enough troops to do a sneak operation. So I think they would at least try to break out to Baltimore. The problem that I see with that is Lincoln's already suspended habeas corpus. You already, you have a secessionist Maryland who can portray the Baltimore riot as the second, Boston massacre with Union troops shooting on innocent people in the street. So I think that actually, depending on the timing of it, that might actually push some border states into perceiving Lincoln as more of an aggressor and actually, at least part of some border states flipping to the Confederacy. Just because of you see this sort of tyrant Lincoln that you heard some, kind of early war, Democrats really talk about. Now you have Lincoln in a much more negative light. He's aggressively moving into Confederate territory instead of trying to secure federal territory that stays there.
I think I don't agree with that, because I think if you've got a disputed government, you've got the Frederick, Maryland government,
Mhm.
and let's call it the Waldorf or the Annapolis government. Just like today, when one side says something is an outrage and you've got all of these horrible things happening, the other side can legitimately claim our government of Maryland called in this support to help put down a riot as opposed to a revolution. So
Okay.
I think just from a PR standpoint, like, this is one of the things you hear about. What one of the problems with media coverage is, like, people are going to agree with what they agree with. And there's at least a plausible legitimacy to a pro-unionist government saying, no, this is a riot, and we asked for the National Guard, for the militia to be called out, because that's what these units were. They were state militias. We asked for help to help put down a riot.
Well, I think, if I can jump in here, I
Yeah.
think that this could be, if we're going to go with the whole, governments in exile, like
Mhm.
competing governments sort of thing, which I think actually makes a lot of sense, just given the makeup of the state. I think we
again,
can almost,
it's exactly what happened in Kentucky as well.
yeah, and I'm going to say with Missouri as well, we
Mhm.
had a whole, Confederate government in exile that happened, and the Unionist government was in control. So I think we could almost kind of look at this as sort of a reverse Missouri in a way, where instead of it being the Confederate government that's not controlling anything and it's in exile, we essentially have the pro-Union side that is, in exile. I think that's what's most likely.
At the very beginning.
Yeah.
Very quickly, the Union government of Maryland's going to have some friends that show up pretty quick.
Yeah.
Well,
So
then the question to accelerate the timeline forward.
Yeah.
So now we're in a Maryland early 1862. Instead of battles occurring on the Virginia border, are they now occurring on the Maryland border? Or are we looking at not a Gettysburg, but a Frederick? So along there's a creek, Pipe Creek, that runs along Frederick,
Mhm.
Union Mills area, where the Union Army originally planned on setting up shop when Lee invaded Pennsylvania in 1863. Do we have battles in that area earlier versus going to Virginia for the battles?
I think you see a battle of Waldorf, and let me explain
Okay.
that a little bit. One of the things about Lee's Maryland campaign is he had been reading the pro-Confederate news and thought, all I have to do is cross the river and I'm going to be welcomed as a liberator. Like, Maryland's going to just, I'm going to have flocks of people coming to me, except that he crosses the Potomac and goes into Unionist Maryland. He goes right into the place where the Maryland governor went to have a Unionist city on his side. I think if you look at kind of a map here, what's going to happen is, if there are two governments, I think Southern Maryland, the part by the mouth of the Potomac, is probably going to be where that would set up. That is going to have Lee across the Potomac into a part of Maryland that actually supports him. So down there would be where, if anything, the 1862 battle would be.
Okay.
Is it a fair thing to say, though, Chris, from what I understand about the breakout here, and I knew stuff that I knew, but I've learned stuff in terms of getting ready for this episode too, or reminded of things. Baltimore, though, is heavily enough pro secession, pro Confederacy, that at least that if you're going to have fighting, and there's part of the reason you have what you have happen there is you have enough forces there that there might be contests over Baltimore, or is it once it's occupied, is it occupied?
I'm going to be honest. I am not willing to say that Baltimore is that heavily secessionist. Look at a map of Maryland from the gubernatorial election we're talking about. And by the way, this is one of those really fun things. This is probably a place where there was almost certainly a lot of that electoral fraud we were talking about. But City of Baltimore is going for Hicks, the
Copperhead Democrat.
The Copperhead, the stay in the Union candidate.
The know nothing candidate who
Yeah,
was
the
very
know
pro-
nothing. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, by something north of 60%. So
you almost want to say I can kind of envision a Confederate occupation just or an attempted occupation. You don't think in terms of like a sneak attack, just like get in there quick?
I don't think they have. I believe these were protesters, but protesters don't vote or
disorganized and yeah.
I mean, that is a good point. And
they can be very angry. They can make a lot of noise. They can make a lot of disruption. But that doesn't mean the majority of the people in the city of Baltimore are going to be behind this.
Yeah. I think hopping back a little bit to what Robert was talking about, Lee actually doesn't take over the Confederate forces until spring of 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign.
Yeah, April 1862, because Joe Johnston is injured.
Because Joe Johnston is injured. And so I think, and maybe this is getting a little bit too far into the weeds here, a little bit too much where we don't know the what ifs, but if there is no Battle of Seven Pines, which is where Johnston was wounded, does Lee ever take over? Or do we view it as an inevitability? And in the little bit of digging that I did on, the sensibilities of the Confederates leadership and, their views on Johnston and Lee, I imagine Lee would have taken over eventually, regardless of, Johnston being injured. But that is, to me, an open question. Like, when does Lee take over from a logistical standpoint, and how does that impact the Confederates' response?
Unless here's another big, your butterfly effect affects the Battle of Shiloh. Albert Sidney is not killed. So does Albert Sidney come in and take over, because Albert Sidney was considered the quote unquote preeminent general in the Confederacy prior to Lee's rise to prominence.
Well, I think the one thing, we should come to some decision to kind of get a chronological something put together here.
Yeah.
If there is a Maryland Confederate government, I think we've kind of said the Union is going to see that as a major threat and is going to deploy the majority of its troops against it.
And you have to eliminate that before you go and do other things to a great degree because
frees up so much movement. Yeah.
Right, because of logistical proximity, and also because you can't be having that. Well, in the theme of the view of the global viewpoint about what's going on inside your nation, right?
So you're going to have the Battle of Bull Run doesn't happen in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, I agree.
It's going to be fighting. The one thing I would wonder is, and I'm literally sitting here looking at a map, would the Union basically clear out southern Maryland? Or, because if you look at, Washington and Baltimore are maybe 40 miles apart. Baltimore is northeast of Washington. You could pretty easily build a defensive line between maybe Annapolis and the Potomac, leave the Confederates in the southern part of Maryland, but you have secured your line, you have secured your logistics in and out of Washington.
Yeah, because if you can get from DC to Baltimore to like Wilmington, you can kind of, as long as you can get the logistics, you can cut off most of the peninsula from your at least immediate considerations, because you have your supplies up to New York and Philadelphia secure.
Right.
And almost everything that I read in speculation, when you would go looking for speculation about what people have thought, the first place they tend to go is, well, wouldn't it have been great if the Confederates had Baltimore as a port to utilize as operationally during the war, which obviously
they wouldn't have been able to do anything with it. I don't think.
Yeah,
They didn't have any ships.
That's where I kept coming back to, is that, okay, that's great, yes, and it sounds great, but practically it does nothing in terms of actually changing anything. And then the other thing you would often see laid out by those who are making the case is, well, Maryland was more industrial than most of the rest of the South.
I was fixing to bring that up. That was going to be the one thing that might have changed some things in my head.
And that would have had an impact, because why that has an impact is just how non-industrialized the South is. The fact that Maryland looks like this great industrial complex, tells you how bad the situation is, if that's the way you're looking at it.
But what
right?
parts of Maryland
Honestly.
are industrial?
It's all the northern parts.
The Unionist parts.
It's the Unionist
all the
parts.
parts
They're
that
not
don't
gonna
care
be-
about having slave labor on a plantation.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
This is how things feed into themselves and become self-fulfilling. And so, I found initially, that's interesting. That's interesting. It's like, yes, it's interesting, but it's just it's not real in the sense of anything that actually it's going to happen, or even if it did happen, has the impact that you might imagine that it might happen. At least that's the way that I concluded that.
Yeah.
The biggest
And I
thing
think-
that sorry, Evan, go ahead.
Yeah, all good. I was just gonna say, I personally feel, just based on just my research and geographically speaking, and especially just our discussion here has kind of reinforced my view on this, is that I think the military benefit of having this territory, whether it's the whole state or just like the Baltimore, seaport kind of surrounding area, I think it's really more of a like kind of coup de grace of, oh, propaganda, we have this, that's great. But then when it actually comes down to the nuts and bolts of executing the war effort and the war plan, well, this is going to, incentivize Lincoln to want to shore up the defenses on, DC if he doesn't decide to leave, and support the pro-unionist government in the West. It's like, to me personally, I kind of always have felt, even before doing a deep dive, I felt like this would lead to increased logistical challenges for the Confederacy to try and maintain this territory. With resources possibly being, they're going to have to make a call at some point of, do we keep, trying to harass and break through the defenses here, or do we need to, shore up our efforts and shore up our defenses somewhere else? That's kind of what I personally always felt, but maybe one of you guys disagree.
No, I think that's right. I also was struck by because I wasn't sure if the timing of some of the Civil War was going to get actually moved up in terms of when battles start happening. Because if you put, at least in the outset, I think we've all kind of settled on that relatively quickly into the war, Maryland will, even if they try to secede, they will become Unionist by occupation again.
Whether or not they like it, they'll become Unionists.
Yeah, at least some of them are going to like it. At least some of them are not. But basically, it's going to, within, say maybe by late 1862 or even early 1862, it's back in Union hands. But does that speed up the timetable of battles? Because the first kind of beginning of the war, up until the summer of 1862, once you start having, Bull Run 1, Antietam, Sharpsburg, and all that, there's it's like a playing card deck full of Union generals, and you don't know who's going to do what. If the Union has to act more quickly to try and secure Baltimore, and two, has to try and cobble together an army with whatever they've got around Washington and the environs, does that accelerate the battlefield timeline? Do we start seeing some battles? Not a lot, but before the winter season of 1861, does that mean that McClellan becomes more of a factor because he doesn't have these imaginary giant Confederate armies to sit and wait on? He knows that it's kind of hard scrabble. Or does somebody else like Meade, who's in DC, or John Pope, who escorted Lincoln in, does McClellan become a non-factor? Do we see some of these other generals
I think
you know,
it's very
kind of take
likely
the
that
lead.
McClellan becomes a non-factor. McClellan, from my understanding, is much better of a like a trainer and somebody who like he knows his stuff in terms of war and logistics. But from my understanding and my remembrance is that he was more of the kind of as you referred to it, Dylan, kind of like the revolving carousel of Union generals, especially towards the start of the war, where he was like, "Yeah, should we do this? Should we not do this?" You know. And
So do
then we have
you see him maybe as like a Winfield Scott late career kind of like armchair general sort of?
I think that that's a possibility. It took like a General Sherman, for example, to just come along and be like, "Nope, I don't care. I'm smashing the South. I'm doing my rampage to the sea." McClellan was basically the opposite of that, and has
Yeah.
about every sense of the word that you can get. So I think he becomes more irrelevant over time because Lincoln would have probably wanted to find someone who would be more aggressive. That's
Maybe
just
to
my view.
move it to a more modern comparison, maybe a McClellan is more like a George Marshall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Organized.
I can see that.
Marshall
Yeah.
Marshall versus Eisenhower.
Organizing,
Yeah.
training, and
Yep.
building an army versus
Yeah.
actually using it.
100%. And so something that I think is a possibility as well is in this timeline, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And a big reason why he does this is he wants to prevent European involvement in the war. And if we're going with the idea that DC might not even necessarily be captured, and there is this kind of split, government going on, would we see more battles moved up in the schedule? We might have, but I personally feel like, things might have even been sped up more in terms of what Lincoln does. Is he's like, okay, I've suspended habeas corpus, and you know what? Long as I'm at it, I think I should just preempt even any possibility of Britain joining, the Confederate side. I'm going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Almost the feeling like I've already paid all of the political price. I'm
so
going
it's
to pay.
it's the contra to Lincoln the tyrant. He's just going to go ahead and
Yep.
He's like, you know what? I'm already in this knee deep.
Yeah.
I might as well just do it.
He's just going to do it and get it over with.
I've already paid the price with my border states.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've got nothing to worry
they're
about.
Gone,
yeah.
or at least only Maryland. It might just be Maryland at this point. Maryland's
again,
gone. I'll do it.
And one other thing that might encourage him is he doesn't lose a lot of congressional seats until the 1862 midterm.
Right.
Yeah.
So he has a lot more congressional support.
I think the one part of the war is this: that southern Maryland peninsula between the Chesapeake and the Potomac, what happens to it? It is Confederate country. It is very friendly to the Confederates, but it's on the Unionist side of a major body of water that is very hard to get troops and supplies across. So rather than chasing Confederates through Northern Virginia, I think you've got a much larger impetus to go and fight down there. And to almost as if we don't want to even let the Confederates have a toehold in any of our states.
Yeah.
Here's the other part of it. We kind of got way ahead of ourselves by talking about the Peninsula Campaign. The Peninsula Campaign was an amphibious invasion that was embarked at Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Now we're looking at a situation where that entire invasion force is sailing through a Confederate-controlled straits at the mouth of the Potomac, unless you go in and drive the Confederates out of Southern Maryland. So you've got to do that before you can.
Yep. Well, I'm going to throw 100%. Out that Wilmington, Delaware becomes a major logistical point for the Union Army.
I think so.
Point.
I
just because of where it is.
Yeah,
and it's right there. You can sail down. You can take the peninsula. You can,
and even maybe from a naval perspective too, because it's close. It's close enough to the mouth of the river that you can at least build up a rough shipping yard. Because Norfolk is the thing that they have to worry about at the mouth of the Chesapeake, right there. So, do we think, to kind of try and at least sort of consolidate everything here, because I know we are kind of getting close to time. Yep. So do we think long term? I mean, I know we've kind of shifted some of the battles of the East Coast around, the peninsula when stuff starts happening. Is it north or south of Washington? Does Maryland switching sides at the beginning have any impact on the war overall? I mean, does it do more than maybe extend it by a little bit? Do we think it's going to do any major change to the outcome or significant extension to the conflict at all?
I think it
don't-
shortens it.
Yeah, I was about to go exactly there, Robert, in the sense that it creates, we've already talked about this, some new different senses of urgency
Yep.
early on in the war that caused the emergence of tactical considerations that took longer to develop than they did otherwise,
Mhm.
and personnel considerations that took longer. I mean, I'm thinking back, I'm constantly thinking here to an episode called Little Mac, Move After Christmas, that Chris, you and Robert did, that was around, McClellan, the situation there. And, George McClellan had a lot of strengths, but George McClellan's strength was not being a field commander of a major army in this era. You would have had to find somebody to serve that role, whoever that was, for however it got done, because the stakes would have been too high.
100%.
And we saw a little bit of Lincoln's resolve in how quickly he recognized Baltimore is going to be federal. I'm not even
Yep.
going to take the chance on this. You talk about, Robert, you've been the one that mentioned that he takes a position on Federal Hill, and the thing that I was listening to or watching earlier today, he could cover 75% of the city by cannon from there, and those cannon were faced onto the city in case the need to be there for that. So I agree. I think there's there's basically in no context a way that the South can win other than a negotiated outcome, because the industrial capacity is working against them, the manpower capacity is working against them in the long term. To Dylan's point, could it go longer or shorter? I can make an argument for longer, but I think this is an accelerant. This makes it actually go shorter.
I think
I think so.
It pulls Confederate troops over the Potomac
And gets them
into this pocket in southern Maryland.
it's like a Dunkirk that doesn't end
Yep.
quite as well. Yeah,
Right.
that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah,
we
I
think
think
it-
so.
Do we think it ends before the 64 election? Maybe.
That's big. That's a big
Potentially.
question.
I think that's huge.
Because
Yeah.
and the reason why I'm going with that is, one, if it does, that means Lincoln doesn't bring in, I mean, he can, but he doesn't maybe feel the need to bring in Johnson as his vice
I was
president so much
just
as
starting
maybe
to think along those lines.
maybe
Maybe
one of
you
the generals.
Maybe you actually have Reconstruction carried out.
Well, because also if Maryland is a Confederate state for long enough, John Wilkes Booth may end up serving in a Confederate regiment.
Yep.
He's in New
Yeah,
York when
100%.
it breaks out, but he may come back and then get a mini ball to the face, and then Lincoln gets to see at least one more terrible comedy show at Ford's Theater.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what I was thinking. Is I think in terms of the war itself, I think it's a very strong argument. I initially, when I thought of this topic, I thought that it might extend the war by a few months, but I've kind of become more convinced over the course of this discussion that it probably not only, shortens things, but it also probably leads to, I think it's more of a cultural sort of reverberation that we probably see today. We probably see more of a, pronounced north-south sort of difference, because like the Civil War is referred to in the South as what? The War of
War of
Northern Aggression,
Or another
right?
aggression.
So I think in particular pockets of Maryland, I think that they would identify much more readily with the South. And
Oh, those
that
pockets
has a
do right
huge-
now. Those pockets do right now.
They
I
do
will
right now,
definitely
and they
get
weren't
the-
even part of the South. So
Right.
I think that makes just the cultural reverberations in terms of how Maryland sees itself much differently. I think that, yeah, to the point that we've just talking about, it's very likely that Abraham Lincoln escapes assassination and is able to carry on Reconstruction as he intended. And that would be huge if Johnson isn't in line, if he's not even vice president, because it's not a necessity for Abraham Lincoln to have him as vice president. That would be a whole nother interesting episode that we could possibly do on, on this. I guess we can call it the Southern Maryland timeline of does Lincoln stick around?
Yeah.
And if so, what does a new Lincoln Reconstruction mean? I think that'd be a cool.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was just thinking, because I will fully take the blame for this, Don, but as we're coming to learn about most of my episodes that I become involved with relatively significantly, I keep extending them. I think I've had several 2-parters. I think we've talked about a 4-parter that we've done 1 part of. So I think this may be able to be the first part of, because the conclusion of this fork, I think, sets us up for kind of an interesting discussion of what would a reconstruction have been under, a Lincoln administration, especially with an earlier Civil War and some things like that, because Reconstruction really does affect the whole rest of the century.
It changes the psyche of the South and
Reconstruction
a lot of
things
things
through today, I would
Yes,
argue.
exactly. So I think,
and the other fun place to ping pong too, Dylan, and it's okay for you to set us up for multi-episode arcs. Where we're
I'm just trying to keep us around. That's just thinking it like that.
And you're welcome to do that, because we all know we're all sovereign citizens and we can do whatever we want to anyway at the end of the day.
Yep, totally.
But the other part of that is we haven't even discussed. Okay, you changed the war in the Virginia Eastern Theater.
And what happens out west?
What happens out west? You can quickly argue, well, a lot of things will stay the same because the Western Theater is the Western Theater for what it is. But we all know that when you're dealing with men, material, and what you're able to devote to, that probably changes things. And that, by the way, that becomes an argument for me. Another reason why the war potentially is shorter, because you don't have the ability to fight. It was already a challenge for the Confederacy to fight on multiple fronts in the real timeline. And if you change the calculus here, I think it becomes an order of magnitude more difficult for them to do some things down the road. But I don't know, that'd be a fun thing to explore too.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Because ultimately, you also probably may not ultimately end up with a Ulysses S. Grant, because he comes out of the West.
Yeah.
And if things are different.
I had 2 parts. Now we have 3 parts.
because
it just keeps expanding.
My tease on the Western Theater is those men and material come down into the Eastern Theater, and you use them to quash Maryland. And while you're there, you've got the army, why you've got everybody there, there is no Robert E. Lee. There is only Joseph E. Johnston. You just roll straight into Virginia and grab Jefferson Davis.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is how close Richmond is, to the front as well. This weird decision, I always think of it as like the really, because there also was heavily advertised 20 years ago. This may resonate more with Robert, maybe Chris a little bit more. The Civil War chess set, if you remember that, you could buy it one piece at a time, forever and a day. This advertisement that was out there. But what always struck me about that is this idea that they put both of their kings in the middle of the board, to a degree, in the sense of where DC and Richmond was. It's like, if it's about killing the king, this is not helping, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I enjoy that by giving it over. We've gone from the American Civil War and turned this into a land war in Asia, where there is no end to it. We're just getting sucked deeper and deeper into it.
But we haven't engaged in a battle of wits to the death when a Sicilian is on the other side. So we have to. We kept ourselves in control.
You're right.
We kept our wits about us.
You're right. I am Neapolitan.
One thing I will say is, I just kind of the fun little thing I thought about with this too is, I haven't gotten to the episode yet in my re-listening where we talked about why Wyoming doesn't exist. But I think from this discussion, I kind of thought of something. I'm like, has anything important, now no offense to my fellow Americans from the great state of Delaware, but has anything important happened there in the Civil War, in, they were the first state in the Constitutional Convention era, but as far as I'm aware, this timeline could have elevated Delaware's importance. So the question I want to kind of drop the nuclear bomb on and just walk away slowly like I didn't do anything is prove to me that Delaware exists. Like, how is Delaware not just... how is Delaware not a insurance company created convention?
Let me tell you this. Try and drive 95. Delaware is just a tax dodge that is designed to milk Marylanders and Pennsylvanians for like it's amazing.
And anyone
95
who wants to form an LLC anywhere
Yes.
from
Yeah,
across
that's
the
what I'm
country.
saying.
It-
And
it-
I actually, funnily enough, I thought of this conspiracy like completely independently. I looked on the internet. There are actually some people who are putting this whole, Delaware doesn't exist thing. So I'm like, okay, I think this is something we should investigate.
Again, I will tell you, just look at my freaking Easy Pass statements. Delaware exists. And I swear,
At least something the government wants you to think is
I
Delaware exists.
swear this
Yeah.
has got something to do with Joe Biden filibustering back in like Eisenhower's days when they were building the interstates. They wanted it just to clip the state just so they could toll you. That's that's it.
100%.
All
We've
right.
uncovered something big here.
We start examining the Civil War and we go unravel conspiracies.
Yeah.
A Fork in Time has it all.
Like all of a sudden,
We
the
love
Great
it.
48 turned into the Great 46 now. We're just losing states on it.
We just, by the
Yeah.
end of our tenure, we might only have a couple states left. Who knows?
It's the great state battle royale. All right, that was fun, guys.
Can we
a lot of
merge the
fun.
Dakotas, by the way? Can we just vote to merge them?
Oh, 100%. I'm
You
down
know what?
for that.
Yeah,
We don't
the
even have
fact
to
that
vote
it
on
was what
Yes.
Harrison who flipped a coin
Yeah.
to see which one would get in first. That was hilarious to me. I thought
Yeah.
that was funny. But yeah, just merge them at this point. What's the difference?
Yeah, it'll work out. So anybody, I guess now that we've I guess squeezed all the juice out of that and several other oranges while we were at it.
We squeezed the blood out of many turnips.
Does anybody have any final thoughts we want to end on?
I just have one that's episode related, but not. Evan, have really enjoyed having you be part of the episode today, and bring the idea forward. And also just want to say, we say all the time, we pump our Discord hard because we like the idea of turning a one-way audio medium called a podcast into something that's two-way conversation. We've actually managed to do that, and you are living proof of that. So that's
Well,
the way
Don,
that I
thank
think
you so
about it.
much. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to hang out with a fellow history nerd and take on my topic. It's been a blast. Like, it's been beyond what I could have even thought this could have gone on. And yeah, I'm just honored to be a part of the show. So thank you guys for having me.
Good.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Evan. Hopefully, we'll if we can ever get around to another second or third part of one of my multi-episode arcs that I keep creating, we'll see if we can try and get you back on and see if we can keep doing some more damage. But
Yeah, that'd be great.
Don, I guess as our faithful leader, our Kim Jong Un with better
Ooh.
hair, if you will.
Ooh.
Um,
I don't even know
Let's
if
be
the hair.
honest,
I
it's
don't
not
even,
a
I don't
really
even know if the
high
hair.
bar.
I don't even know if the hair.
Uh-oh.
Sadly, I don't even know if the hair is even better than his now. He's got some interesting hair.
he does.
going on.
He's got some
Well,
good hair.
No. By the way,
Look up the
no.
state-approved North Korean haircuts.
No.
It's interesting. I'll just put it that way.
No, he is the Kim Il Sung because like he already does have 3 generations lining up to take
Oh, that's
over
true.
the
Yes, that's a
podcast.
very good
Yeah.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Excellent observation.
Yeah, we
It's-
haven't officially invested my grandson with the
His official haircut yet?
when now I'm chasing a topic that's out here. I have curly hair. Alexis has curly hair. As a result, Connor's hair is getting longer and it's getting curlier. So,
Okay.
so he's going to inherit the rights to do some. By the way, he's quasi walking now. So watch out, boys.
Watch
Here he
out,
comes.
world. Yeah.
Yeah, watch out, boys. Here he comes. But yeah, we're trying to set up the multi-generational thing here. For the kids. It's just for the kids, Chris. At the end of the day, it's not for us. But yeah, I will say that again, I've said this so often. This type of episode is exactly why we've enjoyed doing A Fork in Time now for over 5 years and over 150,000 downloads of episodes worth during that period of time. Is that, again, with the exception of Robert that I mentioned at the start of the show, I didn't know these other 4 cats that are on my screen right now before all of this. And to Evan's point, we share a common. We share the terms that he used. We're all history nerds that like to talk and have fun and be playful about it. And that's why we do A Fork in Time. That's why Alexis and I started it. And we're so happy that it's not just me and Alexis waiting for Connor to get big enough to be able to actually take the 3rd seat. Other folks have come along to take the other seats, which is a good thing. So I'll use this as an opportunity to say thanks to Dylan for leading the charge on this one. Thanks for all the guys for participating here. Just reminding folks that I always do visit the website, check out the Discord page, all the stuff that you will find in the show notes. If I do a good job here, I'll go back in and link some of these episodes that we've mentioned. That's always, I know, a helpful thing for folks who might not have found them. By the way, it was a Brody Burton episode 76.
Yes. That's the distinguished
Brody,
gentleman.
yeah, Brody that joined us there. So you'll find that in there. And as we always do here on A Fork in Time, our suggestion is really quite simple. If you happen upon a fork in time, our suggestion is that you take it. Talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.